The desert stretched endlessly under the pale morning sun, its sands shifting in quiet waves as the wind swept across jagged rocks and dried-out shrubs. The horizon shimmered in the heat, a mirage dancing where sky met earth, and somewhere out there beyond 4,000 meters, was the target the world said could not be reached. General Arya Solon adjusted her scope with steady hands, the metal of the rifle pressed firm against her shoulder, and every soldier watching behind her fell silent. They had trained for months, fought wars across continents, broken limits that no one thought could be broken, but what she was attempting now had been dismissed as impossible even by those who lived and breathed sniping. 4,000 meters was more than distance. It was a graveyard of missed shots, of bullets lost to wind drift, of dreams crushed by the laws of physics. She had been told it could not be done, that even the most advanced weapon systems would falter, that sound itself would reach the target before her bullet did, and yet here she was, kneeling on one knee, the scope aligned with an enemy general's command post barely visible to the naked eye. The silence grew heavier with every passing second as her soldiers waited for the impossible to unfold, and she remembered the words of her instructors long ago, words that had carved themselves into her discipline. If the shot matters enough, you will find a way. She breathed out, slowly, evenly, as if she could control the desert air itself, her finger resting on the trigger like a secret she was about to unleash. The mission was not just about a single target, it was about saving 3 entire battalions pinned down in the canyon beyond. If the enemy general gave the order, artillery would rain down within minutes and thousands of her soldiers would die. To stop that, she needed to make this shot, one so far beyond military records that it bordered on madness. Her spotter, Lieutenant Kale, whispered the wind speed, his voice barely audible, but Arya did not reply. She already felt the rhythm of the currents, the push and pull of nature itself bending invisibly across her line of sight. Sweat traced a path down her temple, not from fear but from the sheer heat of the sun pressing down, and she let the world narrow until all that existed was the faint figure on the horizon, blurred by distance, moving between tents of sand-colored canvas. Every muscle in her body had gone still, her breathing slowed, her heartbeat softened until it no longer rattled her chest. Time stretched, seconds becoming vast oceans, and then, with the calm of a predator striking, she pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, a thunder that echoed off the rocks, and the recoil surged into her shoulder like a living thing, but her eye never left the scope. She followed the invisible path of the bullet across 4 kilometers of desert, knowing it would take seconds for it to arrive, seconds where doubt could creep in, where the mind screamed that the laws of nature could not be broken. The sound of the shot reached her ears and rolled outward across the plain, slower than the bullet itself, but still fierce enough to make nearby soldiers flinch. The target remained upright, unaware that death was already on its way, and then, an instant later, he dropped, collapsed as if the desert itself had pulled him down. For a moment no one spoke, the silence so absolute it felt as if the world had stopped spinning, and then disbelief turned to awe. The enemy camp rippled with chaos as commanders rushed to the fallen general's side, their formations breaking apart in confusion. Behind Arya, her own soldiers gasped, some cursing, some laughing, all unable to process what they had just witnessed. 4,000 meters, a range that textbooks said was beyond human reach, had been crossed, and it had been crossed by their general. Kale tore off his headset, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. You hit him, he whispered, but Arya only lowered the rifle, her expression unreadable. To her, it had never been about proving a point or setting a record. It was about survival, about saving those men and women trapped in the canyon. Even now, as the enemy's chain of command disintegrated, she was already issuing orders to advance, to secure the ridge, to push forward before the enemy could recover. Her soldiers obeyed instantly, driven by the unshakable confidence she inspired, their disbelief transforming into fire in their veins. As they surged into the desert, the impossible shot faded into legend, whispered among the ranks as proof that their general was more than just a leader, she was a force of nature. But Arya herself felt no triumph. She knew the war was far from over, that the death of one enemy general would not end the tide of blood, and yet deep inside she carried a quiet certainty. Limits were illusions, barriers were chains forged by fear, and as long as she drew breath she would shatter them again and again until victory was carved into history. She stood, slinging the massive rifle across her back, her eyes already scanning the horizon for the next threat, while the wind carried the echo of her shot farther than any bullet had ever traveled, a reminder that what was once thought impossible had just become real. The desert had erupted into chaos after the shot, and the enemy's chain of command fractured so violently that the sound of shouts and scrambling feet carried across the wind like a broken song. Arya moved with her unit along the ridge, boots crunching over gravel and loose sand, every sense sharpened, every decision calculated. She had no time to marvel at what had just happened because she knew what came next. An army without leadership was dangerous, unpredictable, and more likely to lash out in blind rage than to retreat in order. Her radio crackled as one of her captains reported from the canyon where their 3 battalions had been pinned down, his voice raw with relief. "General, enemy artillery crews are in disarray, they're pulling back, some abandoning their positions entirely." She answered with clipped precision, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Push forward and secure the guns before they regroup. No hesitation. The ridge will cover your advance." Her soldiers moved with the disciplined fury of people who believed in the impossible because they had just seen it. The air was alive with the metallic rhythm of weapons being loaded, the clank of gear against armor, the quick breathing of warriors ready to gamble everything. Arya led from the front, her rifle slung but her sidearm drawn, every step deliberate, a silent reminder to her people that leadership was not about barking orders from safety but about standing where the fire was hottest. She descended the slope with Kale close behind, the young lieutenant still rattled by what he had witnessed but trying to bury his awe under professionalism. "General, the range? That shouldn't be possible." "Physics alone," he began, but Arya cut him off with a sharp glance. "Physics doesn't win wars, Lieutenant. Discipline does. Focus." He swallowed his words and fell into step, and together they pressed forward into the swirling dust and confusion that marked the enemy's unraveling. The enemy camp below was a storm of broken formations, soldiers scattering, some clinging to what remained of order while others broke ranks entirely. Arya spotted a cluster of officers rallying near a half-buried bunker, their frantic gestures betraying an attempt to restore control. And she signaled her marksmen. 3 rifles fired in unison, clean and merciless, and the officers crumpled before their shouts could spread. It was not cruelty, she reminded herself as she pressed forward, it was necessity. Every second they delayed was another second the enemy could reorganize, another second her own forces might be caught between collapsing lines and artillery fire. A roar split the sky, not from guns but from aircraft, and she glanced up to see 2 enemy drones streaking low over the battlefield, sleek wings glinting in the sun. They released payloads that whistled down like spears of fire, and explosions rocked the ridge, shaking sand and stone into a choking cloud. Soldiers stumbled but did not falter, driven onward by her voice cutting through the chaos, steady as iron. "Forward. Hold the line, break their heart before they find it again." They surged, and Arya found herself in the thick of it, the enemy scrambling from cover to return fire, their bullets slicing the air with angry cracks. She raised her pistol and dropped 2 before ducking behind a broken outcrop, Kale at her side with his carbine spitting fire into the dust. Adrenaline surged through her veins, sharpening every detail, the acrid sting of smoke, the metallic taste of grit in her mouth, the flicker of muzzle flashes across the camp. She was alive in the storm, not because she sought it but because this was where she belonged, where her decisions bore weight measured in lives and futures. Over comms came another voice, Captain Dren from the canyon. "General, we've secured 2 batteries, enemy crews are abandoning the 3rd. Casualties light, momentum is ours." She allowed herself a breath, short and sharp, before replying. "Good. Redirect those guns to cover the ridge, I want overlapping fire on any enemy trying to regroup east of the camp." Even as she spoke, she moved, always moving because stillness was death in a battlefield unraveling. She directed squads to sweep trenches, ordered medics to pull the wounded back, pointed sharpshooters toward stragglers rallying in the shadows. And through it all, the echo of her impossible shot still hung in the air, invisible yet undeniable, a ghost that seemed to terrify the enemy more than any barrage could. Arya knew fear was as much a weapon as steel or lead. The enemy whispered about what had happened, rumors already spreading like fire that she could kill from beyond the reach of sound, that she was something more than human. She did not care for legends, but she understood their use, and she let the rumor run free, a blade wielded without lifting a hand. The sun climbed higher, burning the desert in relentless light, and still the battle raged though the tide had turned. By noon, enemy resistance was fragmented pockets of defiance rather than organized strength. Arya stood atop a captured gun emplacement, scanning the wreckage below, her face unreadable as she watched smoke curl into the blue. Kale approached, his uniform streaked with dirt and his expression torn between exhaustion and awe. "General, it's done. They're breaking. Pulling back across the flats." She nodded once, then raised her voice over the radio, calm and clear. "All units hold positions. Secure weapons, tend the wounded, sweep for stragglers. No unnecessary pursuit. We've won enough ground today. Around her, soldiers let out ragged cheers, some collapsing in the sand from exhaustion, others raising rifles in salute. They were bloodied, but they were victorious, and every one of them knew it hinged on the moment when their general had turned the impossible into reality. As dusk began to fall and the desert cooled into shadow, Arya finally allowed herself a moment alone on the ridge. She set her rifle across her knees and stared out toward the horizon where her bullet had traveled hours earlier, her thoughts heavy. She knew this victory would echo, not just across the battlefield but across nations. Intelligence agencies would analyze it, generals would whisper about it, enemies would fear it, and allies would demand to know how it had been done. She felt the weight of it pressing on her shoulders like armor she could never remove. She had shattered a limit, and once broken, limits could not be mended. There would always be another battle, another mission where they would expect her to do the impossible again. And she would, because she had no other choice. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to steady the storm inside her. When she opened them, the desert stretched endlessly before her, silent now except for the distant groan of engines retreating into the night, and she whispered into the cooling wind, not for anyone else but for herself, a reminder etched in iron: impossible is just a word. The news of the battle spread faster than any bullet, carried by messengers, intercepted transmissions, and whispered stories among survivors until it reached every command tent and war room within days. The impossible shot had already become legend, though Arya herself ignored the myth that grew in her absence, focusing instead on the fragile aftermath of victory. Her forces had secured the ridge, dismantled the enemy artillery and pushed their foes back across the flats, but she knew better than to believe this war would end with one battle or one fallen general. Wars were hydras, cut off one head and another rose snarling. In the command bunker set up near the canyon, maps covered the walls, red and blue markers stabbing into paper like wounds in the earth, and Arya stood with her senior officers as they reviewed reports. Kale hovered at her side, silent but attentive, while captains argued over supply lines and analysts outlined intercepted enemy communications. The enemy High Council had been thrown into disarray after their general's death, but fragments of leadership were regrouping, some vowing revenge not only against Arya's army but against her personally. Already there were bounties whispered in the black markets, promises of rewards for any mercenary or assassin who could reach her. She listened to the chatter without flinching, her expression steady, her mind already calculating the next moves. "They'll come harder now," she said finally, her voice low but carrying. "They won't make the mistake of underestimating us again. The next battle will not be in the open desert. It will be in the shadows, in places where we are weakest." Her officers fell silent, understanding the truth of her words, and she turned back to the map, her eyes narrowing on a city marked in black ink: Farin, the enemy's industrial stronghold, a fortress where supply lines converged and factories fed the endless war machine. Intelligence suggested that in the power vacuum left by the fallen general, a new commander had risen there, ruthless and cunning, a man named Corvin who had once been dismissed as a bureaucrat but now wielded armies like pieces on a board. If he consolidated control, the war could stretch for years. Arya knew she could not allow it. That night, as the desert cooled into freezing silence and her soldiers found what rest they could, Arya sat alone at a field desk lit by the pale glow of a single lamp. Reports lay scattered before her, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. She had broken the impossible, and now the world expected her to do it again, as if one miracle meant an endless supply of them. She traced the barrel of her rifle with a gloved hand, feeling the grooves and cold steel, and for the first time in years she let herself admit the truth: she was tired. Not in body, for her discipline kept her strong, but in spirit, weighed down by the knowledge that no victory was ever enough, that peace was always temporary, that war had no finish line. She allowed herself one deep breath, then locked it all away again because weariness was a luxury she could not afford. Dawn came, and with it orders that sent ripples across the camp. Units were reassigned, supplies redistributed, wounded evacuated. Arya led every briefing herself, her voice steady, her eyes sharp, and though many soldiers looked at her with something close to reverence, she met their gaze with only the promise of responsibility. They followed not because she was untouchable, but because she never asked of them what she would not do herself. That morning she marched with a forward unit to scout the canyon passes, walking among the mud and dust as though she were not the highest-ranking officer in the field but simply another soldier carrying the weight of survival. Kale trudged beside her, clearly wrestling with thoughts he dared not speak, until finally he blurted out, "General, why do you keep leading from the front? They'll come for you now more than ever. You're worth more than the rest of us combined." Arya glanced at him, her face unreadable. "A leader who hides behind her soldiers is not worth following, Lieutenant. Remember that." He lowered his eyes, chastened, but deep inside a seed of understanding took root. The passes twisted like a serpent through the stone, and it was here they found signs of movement: discarded rations, fresh tracks, and broken branches that suggested scouts had been shadowing their movements. Arya crouched, studying the prints with a practiced eye, noting the depth, the spacing, the weight of each footfall. "Assassins," she murmured, more to herself than to Cale, but he heard it and stiffened. "They'll strike soon when they think we're stretched thin." Her prediction proved correct less than an hour later when the first shot cracked through the canyon, slamming into rock inches from her head. Her soldiers dropped instantly, returning fire toward the ridges above, but the enemy was fast, darting between boulders with lethal precision. Cale swore under his breath as dust rained down, the canyon echoing with gunfire, but Arya was already moving, crawling to a vantage point where her rifle could sing once more. She lifted it with calm efficiency, her heartbeat steady, her breathing controlled, and with each shot she dropped another shadow on the ridge. Her soldiers rallied around her, emboldened by her composure, until the assassin's ambush began to crumble. But they were skilled, more skilled than common raiders, and one managed to slip through the chaos, a blur of motion darting toward Arya with a blade glinting in the sun. Cale shouted a warning, raising his carbine, but he was too slow. The assassin lunged, and in that instant Arya moved like the wind itself, twisting aside, her pistol already in her hand. The shot rang out point blank, and the assassin crumpled at her feet, his weapon clattering to the stones. She stood over him, unshaken, her soldiers staring in stunned silence, and for a brief moment the canyon held its breath. Then the fight was over, the last of the attackers fleeing into the hills, and Arya holstered her pistol with a calmness that seemed unearthly. "They will send more," she said simply, her voice carrying over the stillness. This was only the beginning. Her words settled like iron in the hearts of her soldiers, a warning and a promise all at once, and as they regrouped and prepared to move on, Cale realized with a kind of awe that their general was not merely a leader. She was the storm that broke impossible chains, and nothing the enemy could send would ever be enough to stop her. Word of the failed assassination spread back to the enemy stronghold in Fallen, and in its shadow rose a figure whose name soon became as feared as the legend of Arya's impossible shot. Corvin, the newly risen commander, studied every report with cold precision, his eyes scanning maps and ballistic data as though each detail were a piece of a puzzle only he could solve. Unlike the generals before him, Corvin had never been a soldier on the field. He was a strategist forged in the silence of planning rooms and the ruthless corridors of politics, a man who understood that wars were won as much in the mind as on the battlefield. He watched the shaky footage of Arya's ambush in the canyon, grainy images pulled from helmet cams of the assassins before their deaths, and though others saw only failure, Corvin saw something else. He saw the rhythm of her breathing, the way her soldiers moved with her, the pattern of her decisions. He saw not a miracle but a method, one that could be broken if pressed in the right place. In the weeks that followed, Arya's forces advanced cautiously, pushing across the desert toward the outer edges of Falren's territory. Skirmishes broke out constantly, hit-and-run attacks by mercenaries, sabotage against supply convoys, sniper fire from ridges and ruins. It was not a war of decisive battles anymore, it was a war of attrition, one designed to bleed her army slowly, to fray discipline, to whisper doubt into the ears of even her most loyal captains. Arya noticed the shift immediately. She had fought enough campaigns to recognize when an enemy was testing for cracks, and though her officers urged rapid advances to break through the harassment, she refused. "He wants us impatient," she told Cale one night as they stood over yet another map, lit by the glow of a dying lantern. "He wants us to make mistakes, to overextend. We won't give him that." Cale nodded, though she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the same exhaustion mirrored in her soldiers' shoulders as they trudged through endless sand and ambushes. The strain was beginning to show, and Corvin knew it. Psychological warfare became his weapon of choice. Propaganda leaflets were dropped from drones, carried on the desert winds, filled with lies that Arya had betrayed her allies, that her impossible shot had been a trick of advanced technology rather than skill, that she would abandon her people once the fighting grew too costly. Radio frequencies were flooded with distorted messages, voices mimicking her own giving false orders to confuse her troops. Even food supplies were poisoned in captured towns, turning what should have been safe victories into bitter lessons in caution. Yet through it all, Arya stood unshaken. She burned the propaganda before her soldiers' eyes, not with anger but with calm disdain. She countered false orders by delivering commands in person, walking through the camps at night so her people could see her face, hear her voice, feel her presence. She tested every ration with her own hands before allowing her soldiers to eat, and when the poisons claimed lives despite her efforts, she sat with the dying until their final breaths, refusing to let them face death alone. She became more than a commander, she became the anchor that held her army steady in a storm of shadows. But Corvin was patient, and patience was his deadliest weapon. Weeks turned into months, and every step toward Falren cost Arya's forces blood and strength. Supplies ran thin, reinforcements were delayed, and the endless desert began to feel like an enemy of its own. Arya carried the weight of every decision on her shoulders, knowing that one wrong step could unravel everything they had gained. At night, when the campfires burned low and silence hung heavy, she found herself staring into the darkness, listening for footsteps that never came, her hand always resting on the grip of her pistol. She trusted no shadows, no silence, because she knew Corvin's eyes were always watching. Then came the night when his trap finally sprang. It began with a report of an undefended supply depot deep in the desert, a cache that could replenish her army's dwindling reserves for weeks. Scouts confirmed it, describing half-abandoned warehouses, fuel tanks and munitions stacked high without guard. It was too tempting to ignore, and though every instinct in her blood warned her of danger, the needs of her soldiers outweighed suspicion. She ordered a strike team to move at dawn, leading them herself, because she would never ask her soldiers to risk a path she would not walk. The depot appeared exactly as described, silent, abandoned, filled with crates and drums waiting to be claimed. Her soldiers spread quickly, eyes wide with relief as they began hauling supplies, laughter breaking through the tension for the first time in months. Cale looked at her, doubt flickering in his eyes, but he said nothing. Arya herself walked slowly through the rows of crates, her fingers brushing across metal, her instincts screaming. That was when the ground trembled. A deep, grinding vibration rippled through the desert, and before she could shout a warning the sky erupted. Camouflaged panels peeled back from the sand, revealing hidden batteries of automated guns, their barrels swinging into position with mechanical precision. The depot was no depot at all, it was a trap built to look like salvation, bait laid with perfect patience. The guns opened fire, tearing into the soldiers with merciless efficiency, explosions ripping through crates that were filled not with supplies but with accelerants that turned the air into fire. Screams tore across the camp as men and women scrambled for cover, some cut down before they could even raise their weapons. Cale shoved Arya behind a half-shattered drum, his face pale with terror, shouting over the storm. "We have to fall back." But Arya was already rising, her eyes burning with fury, her rifle swinging into position. She fired with the precision of a predator, each shot disabling a gun, sparks flying as barrels twisted and died, but there were too many. The trap was too perfect. Corvin's voice suddenly echoed over hidden speakers buried in the depot, his tone calm, almost mocking. "General Solon. The woman who defied distance. Did you think I would fight you on the ground of your choosing? No, I will fight you where your legend fails. You cannot shoot patience. You cannot kill inevitability." His laughter crackled through the flames, and for the first time in years, Arya felt the burn of frustration cut deep into her chest. Yet even then, even in the heart of betrayal and fire, she did not falter. She turned to Cale, her voice steady despite the storm. "Rally them. Every soldier we can save. Get them moving. We don't die here." Her soldiers heard her voice above the chaos, and they rallied, dragging the wounded, forming lines of cover fire, turning disaster into desperate survival. The depot burned around them, flames clawing at the sky, but they clawed back, refusing to break, refusing to give Corvin the victory he thought he had secured. And as Arya fought through the fire, her teeth clenched, her hands steady, she made a silent vow into the smoke-filled air. She would break this man, this ghost in the shadows, not with one impossible shot but with the relentless weight of her will, and when he finally fell, the world would know that patience itself could bleed. The morning sun had not yet risen when the camp stirred with muted urgency, every soldier knowing that today would be the day their fate was decided, and at the heart of it stood General Aurora Kane, who had already proven the impossible could be bent to her will but who now faced a challenge that even she understood would push her beyond every limit of endurance, patience and trust in her own instincts. Reports had streamed in overnight that the enemy's long-range artillery had been repositioned on the plateau miles to the east, and their range was such that within 2 hours they would be able to hammer the valley encampment into dust, leaving no shelter and no hope for her people. so the command council pressed her for an answer, yet every option seemed suicidal. Direct assault would cost hundreds of lives in an instant, retreat meant abandoning everything they had fought for, and negotiation was nothing more than a fantasy with an enemy who only respected destruction. The council stared at her, waiting, and she realized again why her presence mattered. Not because she was invulnerable or possessed mythical skill, but because when all others faltered she carried the burden of believing a path still existed, and so she said firmly, "We silenced that battery before sunrise." Her words fell like steel in the room, some doubting, some fearful, but none willing to contradict her openly. As soon as she stepped out into the cold dawn air she felt the weight of expectation pressing down, every soldier's glance saying the same thing, that if anyone could pull off the impossible once more, it was her. She gathered her sniper unit, a small team who trusted her without question, and laid out the plan in precise, stripped-down terms. They would infiltrate the ridge north of the plateau, use its natural shadow to conceal their approach, and she would take the shot herself at the lead artillery commander. Without his coordination the battery would stall, disorganized and vulnerable, and the rest of the army could advance and finish the job. Her second-in-command, Captain Rourke, frowned and whispered that the distance was nearly 4,500 meters, even farther than the legendary 4,000-meter shot that had already become the stuff of barrack stories. But she only met his gaze and said, "If the target breathes, it bleeds. If it bleeds, it can be stopped. We don't measure meters. We measure necessity." Hours later, as the world shifted from darkness into gray dawn, she lay prone on the icy stone of the ridge with her rifle balanced like an extension of her own heartbeat, every muscle stretched into perfect stillness while her spotter whispered wind corrections and range adjustments. The plateau below looked like a nest of ants, artillery pieces hulking machines of steel and smoke, soldiers scurrying between them, and there, near the command flag, stood the figure she sought, a tall officer in a dark coat, shouting orders as crews loaded and adjusted the massive cannons. Her breath slowed, each exhale carefully measured so that the rifle's scope remained steady. She thought of nothing except the line between her and him, a thread of inevitability that she was about to tighten. Time ceased to exist, the world shrinking to crosshairs and distance. She pressed the trigger, and the silence before the shot shattered into thunder that rolled across the ridge. For a fraction of a second nothing happened, the world holding its breath. Then in the far distance she saw the enemy officer jolt backward as though pulled by an invisible wire, his body crumpling to the ground before any of the surrounding soldiers realized what had struck him. The sound of her shot reached them seconds later, an echo bouncing across the plateau, and panic erupted. As men pointed in confusion, artillery crews froze, and the rhythm of their attack dissolved into chaos. Rourke muttered an oath of disbelief, unable to comprehend that she had once again placed a bullet where no one else would have dared try. But Aurora only whispered, "Reload," because she knew one shot was not enough, not today, not against an enemy that would quickly regroup. She worked the bolt, chambered another round, and scanned for targets of higher priority, communications officers, secondary commanders, even gunners who looked too organized. Each shot was methodical, each hit buying another minute for her army. Her team shielded her position, suppressing any enemy scouts who ventured too close, and soon the artillery sight looked less like an organized unit and more like a swarm of frightened animals scattering under unseen fire. The long-range cannons remained motionless, unable to fire without orders, and this delay was everything Aurora had hoped for. She signaled her radio operator, sending the word that the moment had come, and within minutes the valley below erupted as her ground forces surged forward, armored vehicles and infantry moving with a ferocity fueled by the knowledge that their general had already carved the path. The enemy was caught between confusion and sudden assault. Without their commanding officer, they tried to mount a defense, but each attempt was cut short by another long-range strike from Aurora's rifle or the advancing troops. Explosions shook the plateau, dust rising into the sky, and for hours the battle raged until at last the artillery was nothing more than smoldering wreckage. Aurora remained in position the entire time, refusing to abandon her vantage until Rourke finally touched her shoulder and said, "It's over, General. You've broken them." Only then did she allow herself to lower the rifle, muscles aching, eyes burning from hours of unblinking focus, but in her chest a fierce satisfaction burned brighter than exhaustion. When they returned to camp the soldiers greeted her with cheers, voices carrying the disbelief and pride of those who had witnessed history being bent a second time. She walked among them without raising her hand for silence, letting them shout, letting them feel that surge of hope, because she knew that morale was as powerful a weapon as any rifle. Yet in private she allowed herself a moment of raw honesty, confessing to Rourke that the shot had nearly broken her, that every second she had feared the wind would shift or her breath would betray her. He only shook his head and said, "Fear doesn't diminish courage, General. It proves it." She nodded, though inside she wondered how many more times she could ask her body and mind to carry such impossible weight. Night fell again over the valley, this time quiet and free of artillery thunder, and Aurora stood outside her tent staring at the stars. She thought about the lives saved, the enemy crushed, and the legend that now grew around her, but also of the heavy truth that each impossible act chained her more tightly to the expectation of the next. She clenched her fists, feeling the ache in her arms, and whispered into the night, "Let them call it impossible. I'll call it done." The valley lay silent after the destruction of the artillery plateau, the night air cold and clear as smoke drifted lazily toward the sky, carrying the memory of fire and battle with it, and though the soldiers celebrated with laughter and exhaustion in equal measure, General Aurora Kane did not allow herself the luxury of rest because she knew too well that victories were not endpoints but bridges to the next challenge, and every bridge demanded strength to cross. She walked through the camp with the calm presence that her soldiers had come to depend on, acknowledging their salutes and their relieved smiles, yet her mind was far ahead, already calculating what the enemy's retaliation would be and how quickly it might fall upon them. She entered the command tent where Captain Rourke and the other officers were gathered over maps lit by lantern light, their voices subdued now that the adrenaline of combat had ebbed, and she placed her gloves on the table, leaning forward as her eyes swept over the battlefield projections. Rourke was the first to speak, pointing to a mountain pass that stretched like a jagged scar to the north, explaining that scouts had reported movement there, possibly the remnants of the enemy artillery division retreating toward reinforcement zones, and if left unchecked they would regroup with another force, doubling their strength within days. Aurora listened without interruption, her face unreadable, and then she said in her steady tone that they could not afford to let the enemy breathe, not after striking such a decisive blow, for hesitation was the one luxury commanders never survived. Her decision was immediate, a pursuit through the pass before dawn, fast and merciless, cutting down what remained of the retreating forces before they could find sanctuary. Some officers shifted uneasily at her command, for the pass was known to be treacherous terrain, narrow and prone to ambush, but she silenced their concerns with a single sharp glance, reminding them that the enemy's fear was greatest now, and to waste that advantage was to invite death later. Within the hour preparations began, soldiers stripping the camp to essentials, engines of armored carriers growling to life, and scouts sent ahead to mark the safest routes. Aurora herself oversaw the loading of ammunition and supplies, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, her mind fixed on the image of enemy banners burning in the mountain wind. By the time the moon had reached its highest point the column was already moving, a silent procession of men and machines crawling into the darkness of the northern range. The journey into the pass was a test of endurance as much as resolve, the air growing colder, the rocks sharper, the path so narrow that two vehicles could not travel side by side, and always the thought lingered that enemy eyes might be watching from the cliffs above. Aurora rode at the front, her rifle resting across her knees, her gaze scanning every shadow, her soldiers drawing courage from the knowledge that she placed herself where danger was thickest. Hours dragged on until the first gray light of dawn began to touch the peaks, and then a scout came rushing back with news that the enemy column had been sighted less than 5 kilometers ahead, strung out along the pass, vulnerable and disorganized. Aurora did not hesitate, she ordered an immediate advance. Engines roared, boots pounded the frozen earth, and soon the narrow path echoed with the fury of pursuit. The clash was brutal and swift, steel grinding against steel in the confined canyon, explosions throwing fire against the sheer rock walls, but the enemy, already broken by the loss of their commander and artillery, could not withstand the ferocity of Aurora's forces. She directed the attack with sharp, precise orders, every movement calculated to break momentum and crush morale, and soon the pass was filled with the cries of surrender and the smoke of destroyed vehicles. Yet even as victory seemed certain her instincts screamed that danger was not finished, and her eyes caught movement high above on the cliffs. Hidden artillery emplacements, small but deadly, revealed themselves at last, shells raining down onto the pass in desperate vengeance. Soldiers scrambled for cover as rocks shattered and dust choked the air, but Aurora remained steady, her voice cutting through the chaos with clarity. She ordered her sharpshooters to target the gunners, her armored units to push forward despite the bombardment, and she herself climbed onto the ridge of a half-destroyed carrier, rifle braced against its smoking hull, scanning for the telltale flashes of enemy muzzles. Each time she spotted one she fired, her shots precise even through the haze, each kill buying her army another heartbeat of survival. Minutes felt like hours until at last the shelling ceased, the enemy emplacements silenced by a combination of sniper fire and the relentless advance of Aurora's troops up the slopes. When the echoes faded and only silence remained, her soldiers rose again, battered but unbroken, their faith in her deeper than ever. By midday the pass was secure, enemy survivors rounded up and their equipment seized, and Aurora stood at the highest point overlooking the battlefield, wind tugging at her cloak as she surveyed the carnage below. Captain Rourke joined her, his face smeared with dust and blood, and he let out a low whistle as he admitted that no other commander would have dared chase the enemy into such ground. Aurora did not smile, did not even turn her head, but answered quietly that daring was not the measure of leadership, necessity was. She told him that each choice they made carved away at the margin between survival and annihilation, and she would never choose hesitation when action remained possible. Rourke nodded, saying nothing further, for he understood that her drive came not from recklessness but from the grim weight of responsibility she carried. That night they camped on the far side of the pass, torches flickering against the rock faces, soldiers huddled in small groups sharing food and quiet laughter, while guards kept watch on every ridge. Aurora walked among them silently, her presence enough to remind them that vigilance could never falter. In her private tent she finally allowed herself a moment to unlace her boots, stretch her aching legs, and stare at the map spread across the small field table. She traced the lines with her finger, following the roads that would lead deeper into enemy territory, and though exhaustion threatened to drag her into sleep, her mind remained sharp, calculating the days ahead. She thought about the shots she had fired that morning, about the narrow margin by which they had survived, and about the legend that now clung to her name tighter than ever, whispering that she was more than mortal. Yet she knew the truth, that each miracle carried its price, that each impossible victory consumed another piece of her strength, and she wondered silently how many more pieces she had left to give. Still, when she closed her eyes briefly and heard the faint sound of her soldiers laughing beyond the canvas walls, she reminded herself why she bore it all. They did not need to see her doubts or her fatigue, they needed only to see the general who made the impossible happen, who stood between them and despair. And so she breathed deeply, straightened her back, and whispered to herself the vow she had carried since the first day she wore the uniform, that as long as she drew breath, no enemy would break them, no distance would be too far, and no shot would be truly impossible. The mountains behind them were littered with the wreckage of war, and though the soldiers carried pride in their stride as they marched, General Aurora Kane felt the heavier truth in her chest. Every victory carved away at the enemy's body but also at her own soul, and the campaign ahead promised no relief. She rose before dawn as she always did, standing on a ridge to study the distant horizon where the plains stretched toward the enemy heartland. Smoke columns marked villages already burned, and supply convoys scuttled like insects across the roads. Intelligence reports confirmed that the enemy high command was consolidating in the fortified city of Dravik, a place built like a bastion of iron with walls layered in centuries of defenses and an army so vast that to besiege it directly would bleed them dry. Her officers suggested delay, time to fortify their own position and call for reinforcements, but Aurora knew such hesitation was poison. The enemy, given even a handful of weeks, would restore morale, gather allies and counterstrike with fury. The war would stretch into years, swallowing countless lives, and she refused to let that future root itself. Her decision was ruthless in its clarity. They would drive straight toward Dravik, dismantling every supply line, every outpost, every fragment of resistance that fed the city, until the fortress starved in fear before a single shot was fired at its gates. To wage such a campaign demanded precision, speed, and unshakable will, and she looked each officer in the eye, daring them to voice hesitation. None did, for they had learned that her vision did not bend to fear, and so the plan was set in motion. Columns moved like rivers of steel across the plains, striking enemy caravans, ambushing patrols, torching stockpiles, and each time Aurora was at the front, her rifle never missing, her presence like a spearhead piercing deeper into hostile ground. Soldiers spoke her name as though it were a shield, and enemy whispers spread that the general who had struck at 4,000 meters now hunted them across the earth with unerring precision. But the enemy was not idle. Days into their advance, as Aurora's army prepared to cross a wide plain flanked by low ridges, scouts reported unusual stillness ahead. Birds had fled, no livestock moved, and silence pressed against the land like a warning. Aurora felt her instincts prickle, that sharp edge of intuition honed by years of war, and she halted the column, ordering reconnaissance drones and spotters into the ridges. Moments later the trap revealed itself. Artillery hidden beneath camouflage nets, armored divisions waiting to descend, and enemy infantry dug into trenches that stretched farther than the eye could see. It was a kill zone prepared with patience, meant to swallow her entire army in one crushing ambush. Some officers gasped, others muttered curses, but Aurora did not flinch. She studied the landscape, saw not a death trap but an opportunity, and within minutes she issued orders that seemed, to the untrained ear, almost reckless. Instead of retreating, she commanded her forces forward with speed, instructing the left flank to feign collapse, the right flank to surge aggressively, and the central units to split in staggered waves. At the same time she personally climbed into a sniper nest with her spotter, targeting enemy command posts hidden near the ridges. Her first shot rang out, striking an enemy officer just as he raised his hand to signal the artillery. Chaos rippled across their lines, the ambush unraveling as her soldiers executed the deceptive maneuvers with brutal precision. The enemy artillery, uncoordinated, fired too late and too wide, their shells striking empty plains where Aurora's men had already advanced past. Then came the charge. Infantry pouring into the trenches, close quarters combat breaking the ambush into scattered, desperate skirmishes. Aurora remained above the battlefield, every shot she fired silencing another threat, her calm presence radiating across the chaos. By nightfall the plain was theirs, enemy forces shattered, the ambush turned into their own grave. Yet as Aurora walked among the wounded and the dead, her boots heavy with dust and blood, she could not ignore the toll. Hundreds of her own soldiers had fallen, brave men and women who had trusted her commands without question. Their faces lingered in her thoughts as she returned to the command tent, where Rourke and the others waited, exhaustion etched into their features. He told her bluntly that if they continued at this pace, they would bleed themselves dry before reaching Dravik, that even victories had their price. Aurora met his words with silence for a long moment, then replied that war never offered choices without cost. She said that hesitation cost lives just as surely as battle, and if sacrifice was inevitable, it was better spent crushing the enemy's spine than waiting for the knife at their throat. Rourke clenched his jaw but nodded, for though he carried doubts, he also carried loyalty, and he knew she bore the burden of command more heavily than any of them. In the days that followed, Aurora's army advanced with relentless momentum, carving a path of destruction that left the enemy staggering. Outposts crumbled, supply lines vanished, and soon even the whispers in the enemy ranks spoke of fear that Dravik itself would fall. But the closer they drew, the stronger the resistance became, as though the enemy poured every remaining ounce of strength into slowing their march. Aurora felt the pressure tighten like a vice, each decision demanding sharper judgment, each battle cutting deeper into her dwindling reserves of manpower and ammunition. Nights offered no rest. She sat awake studying maps by lamplight, her mind replaying every choice, every shot, every soldier lost. Yet when dawn came she rose unshaken, armor buckled, rifle slung, voice steady, because she knew that if her men saw her falter, the flame of their faith would die. The day finally came when the towers of Dravik appeared on the horizon, black spires rising from the plains like claws tearing at the sky, the walls bristling with guns and banners, the sound of drums carrying across the wind. Her soldiers stared at the fortress with a mixture of awe and dread, their bodies weary but their eyes fixed on their general. Aurora studied the walls, measuring distance and possibilities, her mind already dissecting the ways to starve and break such a bastion. She felt the ache of her own bones, the fatigue hidden beneath iron discipline, but none of that mattered. She whispered under her breath, so low only she could hear, "Another impossible task. Then let it be mine." And with that, she turned to her army, her voice rising like a blade cutting the air, promising them not rest, not comfort, but the certainty that together they would shatter the unshatterable and carve victory where the world believed none could exist. The towers of Dravik loomed higher with each passing mile, their jagged silhouettes like blackened spears tearing into the pale sky, and as General Aurora Kane rode at the head of her column she felt the full weight of history pressing on her shoulders, for every soldier behind her knew this fortress was the heart of the war, the citadel that had fed enemy campaigns for generations, and if it fell the conflict would be over, but if it held then all their victories would wither to ash. The city's walls were monstrous, layered with centuries of stone and steel, bristling with gun emplacements and shielded by heavy artillery. Intelligence confirmed that the enemy's high council had retreated inside, guarded by their finest marksmen and engineers, and whispers claimed they had even brought a legendary sniper of their own, a man trained since birth to fire across impossible distances, stationed on the highest tower to end anyone who dared challenge Dravik. Aurora listened to these reports with a calm face, though her mind recorded every detail, and when her officers debated how to begin the siege she cut through their hesitation with a simple truth. The walls fall when their leaders fall. Break the head and the body crumbles. The plan she forged was audacious, perhaps even madness to anyone else, but to Aurora it was necessity. She would infiltrate the forward ruins with a small team, climb to a vantage point still miles from the city, and from there attempt a shot so unthinkable that even her legendary 4,000-meter strike seemed tame. The distance from her chosen perch to the central tower of Dravik was estimated at 5,000 meters, an ocean of air, wind, and chance, but she knew if the enemy sniper could command from that height, then she would meet him across the void. Some officers pleaded that it was suicide, that even her unmatched precision could not bend a bullet so far, but she silenced them with the same steel that had carried her through every impossible choice. "If he breathes," she said quietly, "he can be killed, and if he commands, we are already dead." That night the army settled in trenches and camps ringing the outer fields, preparing for the long siege, while Aurora slipped away with Rourke and 2 trusted sharpshooters, moving under cover of darkness across the blasted ruins that littered the plain. The journey to the vantage was grueling, each step bringing them closer to the edge of range, each shadow hiding the threat of patrols or watchmen. At last, as dawn tinged the horizon, they reached a broken cathedral whose shattered spire still pointed defiantly skyward. Climbing its rubble, Aurora emerged onto a ledge with a clear, unobstructed view of Dravik. The city's walls shimmered with heat haze, banners snapping in the wind, and there, atop the highest tower, she saw the faint glint of glass that betrayed the rival sniper's scope. He was already watching. The duel began without words. Aurora lay prone, rifle steady, breathing slowed into a rhythm as natural as her heartbeat. Wind gauges whispered, her spotter murmured corrections, and every fiber of her body bent toward the alignment of crosshairs and inevitability. The rival's first shot came before she had even centered him, a supersonic crack that struck the stone inches from her head, spraying shards across her cheek. Rourke cursed and ducked, but Aurora did not flinch. She adjusted her scope, recalculated the drift, and exhaled. Her return shot arced across the expanse like a prayer flung to the heavens, but it struck the tower's parapet, sparks flying harmlessly wide. Another shot hissed past from the enemy, closer this time, forcing her to roll slightly, but she returned again, methodical, her mind stripping away fear until only numbers, angles, and patience remained. Minutes stretched like hours, each exchange a razor's edge. The rival was skilled, perhaps the only marksman alive who could truly match her, his adjustments flawless, his discipline iron. Yet Aurora had lived too long in the company of the impossible to yield. She remembered the plateau, the ambush in the pass, every moment when the world had told her no and she had answered yes. She whispered to herself, unheard by anyone but the wind, "I do not measure meters. I measure necessity." Then she steadied, waited not for his stillness but for the faint tremor of overconfidence, and when it came, a fraction of hesitation as he leaned into his shot, she pressed her trigger. The silence stretched before the bullet arrived, and then across 5,000 meters, she saw the faintest burst of red against the tower's peak. The rival staggered, arms flailing, and toppled from the parapet in a slow, almost graceful fall that ended in silence far below. Aurora did not exhale, did not allow relief. She chambered another round immediately, shifting her scope to the cluster of figures gathered on the battlements beneath the council's banners. One by one she marked them, enemy leaders who had driven the war into endless slaughter, and with each pull of her trigger another collapsed, panic spreading through the fortress like wildfire. Inside the walls, confusion erupted. Soldiers shouted, officers scrambled, and artillery crews faltered without orders. From her vantage Aurora watched the fortress unravel, not through walls breached or gates shattered, but through fear, the realization that no distance could protect them from her reach. She keyed her radio and gave the order, "Advance." Across the plains her army surged, artillery pounding the gates, infantry storming the trenches, armored carriers rolling like thunder. Resistance was fierce, but without leaders it lacked coordination, and soon the once proud walls of Dravik trembled under the weight of relentless assault. Hours later the city burned. Smoke towered into the sky, enemy banners trampled into mud, survivors streaming into the fields with hands raised in surrender. Aurora entered through the shattered gates, her soldiers parting to let her pass, and she climbed the central tower where her rival had once stood. At the peak she looked out over the battlefield, the horizon stretching endless and free, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to close her eyes. Rourke joined her, his voice hoarse as he said that history would never forget this day, that she had broken not only the fortress but the very belief in what was possible. She opened her eyes and answered quietly that history was not her concern, only the lives she had saved by ending the war here now before it could claim another generation. As dusk fell, she walked among her soldiers, who looked at her not only as their general but as something greater, a figure who had turned the impossible into routine, who had carried them through fire and distance to the very heart of victory. She did not smile, did not revel in their worship, but simply nodded, carrying their gratitude like another weight on her back. For she knew legends were chains as much as crowns, and though this war was ended, the world would one day call again for the impossible. And when it did, she would be ready, rifle steady, eyes fixed beyond the horizon, measuring not meters but necessity, forever willing to place her shot before the sound. The end.